Nietzsche begins this analysis from a place most moral thinkers never reach: language. He is not primarily interested in commandments, laws, or ethical systems. He is interested in the words we use to value the world. His reason is simple but radical. Before people obey moral rules, they must first learn how to judge, and judgment is shaped by language long before it is shaped by doctrine. Moral language for Nietzsche is not a neutral tool. It is a historical artifact. Words such as good, bad, and evil are not interchangeable labels for the same moral reality. They encode different ways of seeing the world. A change in moral language signals a deeper change in how human beings experience themselves, others, and life itself. This is why Nietzsche does not treat good and evil as a more intense version of good and bad. He treats it as a different moral universe altogether. The shift from good bad to good evil is not a matter of emphasis. It is a structural transformation in how value operates. To see this, Nietzsche asks us to notice something most people never question. Moral words do not merely describe behavior, they organize perception. They teach us what to notice, what to fear, what to admire, and what to condemn. Once internalized, they operate automatically. We do not reason our way to moral judgments most of the time. We recognize them, almost instinctively. This is why Nietzsche believes that moral revolutions happen first in language, not in law. Before values change politically or institutionally, they change linguistically. New words appear. Old words shift meaning. Certain distinctions become sharper, while others disappear. Over time, these linguistic changes reshape moral intuition itself. The transition from good-bad to good-evil is one of the most consequential linguistic shifts in Western history. Nietzsche believes it marks the moment when morality stops being primarily evaluative and becomes accusatory. Good-bad allows for ranking, difference, and gradation. Good-evil introduces hostility, guilt, and moral warfare. This matters because moral accusation changes how people relate to one another. When someone is bad, they may be inferior, mistaken, or unsuccessful. When someone is evil, they are not merely wrong, they are dangerous. Evil demands opposition. It cannot be tolerated or ignored. It must be resisted, punished, or eliminated. Nietzsche wants us to grasp that this shift happens before anyone argues for it. People do not wake up one day and decide that evil is a better concept. They inherit it. They grow up inside it. By the time moral reasoning begins, the linguistic framework is already in place. This is why Nietzsche treats moral language as more powerful than moral theory. Philosophers can debate ethics endlessly, but everyday moral judgments are made long before such debates are considered. Language shapes instinct, and instinct shapes action. Another reason Nietzsche focuses on language is that moral rules can be broken, but moral categories are harder to escape. Someone can disobey a commandment while still accepting the moral vocabulary that condemns them. The deeper power lies not in enforcement, but in classification, in deciding what counts as good, bad, or evil in the first place. Nietzsche therefore treats moral language as a form of cultural training. It educates emotions. It teaches people what to feel pride in, what to feel ashamed of, and what to fear within themselves. Over time, this training becomes invisible. People experience their moral reactions as natural rather than learned. The distinction between good bad and good evil is crucial because it marks the moment when morality begins to divide the world morally, not just describe it. Neutral space disappears. Difference becomes threat. Evaluation turns into judgment. Nietzsche is not saying that this transformation was a mistake made by foolish people. He believes it was historically necessary under certain conditions. But necessity does not mean harmlessness. A moral language that once solved a problem can later become a problem itself. This is why Nietzsche insists that to understand morality, we must first understand its vocabulary. Before asking what we should value, we must ask how our words taught us to value at all. Only once this is clear can we examine what good and bad originally meant, and how evil entered the moral world. Nietzsche insists that before morality became accusatory, it was descriptive. The earliest moral distinctions were not designed to judge intentions, condemn character, or assign guilt. They were ways of naming differences in value as they were experienced in the world. In these early moral vocabularies, good did not mean morally righteous. It meant noble, admirable, elevated, powerful, beautiful, successful, or life-affirming. The word functioned almost aesthetically. To call something good was to express approval of its form, strength, or excellence, not to praise its moral purity. Just as importantly, bad did not mean wicked or corrupt. It referred to what was common, low, weak, crude, or unremarkable. It named inferiority, not guilt. To be bad was unfortunate, not blameworthy. It did not invite punishment or moral outrage. It simply marked a lower rank in a hierarchy of value. This distinction matters because it shows how non-hostile early valuation was. Difference was accepted as a fact of life. Rank was assumed rather than justified. The strong did not need to accuse the weak, and the weak were not yet trained to accuse the strong. Evaluation flowed from confidence, not from comparison. Nietzsche emphasizes that this original moral language had no inner dimension. It did not ask what someone secretly desired, intended, or thought. Responsibility was tied to visible action. One was judged by what one did, not by one's inner state. There was no systematic suspicion of instinct. This means that early moral life lacked a feature modern people take for granted: moral self-surveillance. There was no constant inward monitoring for impurity, no sense that desire itself was morally dangerous. Instincts were not yet split into acceptable and unacceptable forms. Life was not interpreted through a moral microscope. Another crucial feature of good-bad is that it allowed for plurality. Different groups could value different things without declaring one another immoral. Moral disagreement did not automatically imply hostility. To live differently was not necessarily to live wrongly. Nietzsche believes modern people struggle to imagine this because we have been trained in a moral language that assumes judgment is unavoidable. We instinctively treat evaluation as accusation. Nietzsche is asking us to see that this is not natural, it is historical. The original good-bad distinction also lacked a sense of moral debt. Failure did not produce permanent guilt. Misfortune was not evidence of inner corruption. There was no lingering sense that one owed something to the moral order simply for existing. Life did not require justification. Nietzsche is not praising this world or suggesting it was gentle. It could be brutal, exclusionary, and hierarchical. His point is not ethical endorsement, but psychological orientation. Values arose from affirmation rather than resentment. They did not need to moralize suffering in order to function. Understanding this original meaning is essential because it allows us to see how radical the later transformation will be. Once bad becomes evil, the entire emotional tone of morality changes. Neutral difference disappears. Judgment hardens. Hostility enters the moral vocabulary. But before we examine that transformation, Nietzsche wants us to see clearly what was lost. A way of valuing that could rank and admire without condemning, that could affirm life without placing it under suspicion. Only against this background can we understand why the invention of evil was such a powerful and dangerous innovation. Nietzsche treats the emergence of evil as a turning point, not a refinement. Evil does not simply intensify bad, it changes the function of moral judgment itself. Where bad described inferiority or lack, evil introduces hostility, blame, and moral opposition. The crucial difference is this: bad evaluates, evil condemns. To call something bad is to place it lower in a scale of value, To call something evil is to mark it as a threat. Evil is not merely lesser, it is dangerous. It is not something to be avoided, it is something to be opposed. The moment evil enters moral language, neutrality disappears. Nietzsche argues that this transformation occurs when valuation becomes reactive. Instead of beginning from self-affirmation, value now begins from injury. The question is no longer, what do we admire, but who is responsible for our suffering? Moral language shifts from description to accusation. This is the moment when morality becomes adversarial. In the good-bad framework, difference could exist without moral war. Strength and weakness could coexist without hostility. Once evil appears, difference becomes intolerable. There must now be an enemy. Moral identity requires opposition. One knows who one is by knowing whom one condemns. Nietzsche emphasizes that evil is inseparable from intent. Something is not evil merely because it causes harm. It is evil because it is believed to will harm. This introduces a new kind of moral psychology. Instead of focusing on actions and outcomes, morality begins to probe motives, desires, and inner states. This inward turn is decisive. It allows morality to extend indefinitely. Actions can be hidden, motives cannot. Even when nothing has been done, one can still be morally suspect. The individual becomes permanently accountable, not only for what they do, but for what they might have wanted to do. The invention of evil also introduces moral absolutism. If something is evil, compromise becomes impossible. Context no longer matters. Explanation sounds like excuse. Moral judgment hardens into certainty. This rigidity is not a flaw of the system, it is its strength. Evil must be clear-cut to function as a moral weapon. Nietzsche wants us to see that this transformation is emotionally powerful because it gives suffering a target. Pain no longer feels random or meaningless. It can be blamed. Someone can be held responsible. The world becomes morally legible again, even if that legibility is imposed. This is why the concept of evil spreads so effectively. It answers a psychological need. It provides orientation under conditions of powerlessness. It allows those who cannot act to judge. It allows those who suffer to accuse. Moral clarity replaces practical agency, but this clarity comes at a cost. Once evil enters moral language, life itself becomes morally suspect. Instincts must be interrogated. Strength must be justified. Desire must be explained. Nothing is allowed to simply be what it is. Nietzsche believes that this is the moment when morality begins to turn against life. What began as a strategy for survival becomes a permanent framework for judgment. Over time, it no longer protects the weak. It disciplines everyone. This is why Nietzsche does not treat evil as a moral advance. He treats it as a moral escalation, one that solved a historical problem by creating a deeper psychological one. With the invention of evil, morality gains enormous power. But that power demands something in return. A world divided into enemies and innocents, guilt and purity, condemnation and righteousness. Understanding this shift allows us to ask the next question Nietzsche believes is unavoidable. Why does evil require an enemy to function at all? Nietzsche argues that once moral language introduces evil, it can no longer function in isolation. Evil is not a neutral category, it is inherently relational. To call something evil is already to place it in opposition to oneself. Evil does not merely describe, it points. This is why good-evil morality cannot tolerate ambiguity. It requires an enemy because its values are not self-sustaining. Unlike good-bad valuation, which begins with self-affirmation, good-evil morality begins with hostility. It needs something to resist, condemn, or oppose in order to define itself. In a good-bad framework, good stands on its own. It does not need a villain to exist. But in a good-evil framework, goodness is meaningful only in contrast to evil. Moral identity is formed negatively. One knows who one is by knowing what one is against. Nietzsche sees this as a profound psychological shift. Morality stops being about how one lives and becomes about who one fights. Even when no physical conflict exists, moral conflict must be maintained symbolically. Evil must be identified, named, and kept visible. This is why good-evil morality sharpens boundaries. It eliminates the middle ground. Neutrality becomes suspicious. Difference becomes threat. To stand outside the moral battle is to be morally compromised. Silence begins to look like complicity. The enemy does not have to be a specific person. It can be a type, a class, a symbol, or even an abstract force. What matters is that evil remains personified. Evil must be imagined as something that intends harm, because intention sustains moral outrage. This personification explains why moral discourse under good-evil language becomes emotionally intense. Moral certainty depends on opposition. Without an enemy, moral identity weakens. Condemnation loses its target. Nietzsche also notes that once evil is defined, exemption becomes impossible. If evil is real, then vigilance is required. One must constantly watch for its presence, in others and eventually in oneself. Moral life becomes a permanent state of alertness. This is where morality acquires a policing function. It does not merely guide behavior, it monitors it. Suspicion replaces trust. Interpretation replaces action. People are no longer judged only for what they do, but for what they might represent. Over time, this creates a moral culture that is always on edge. Conflict is not resolved, it is preserved. Moral battles must continue because they provide orientation and meaning. Peace would undermine moral clarity. Nietzsche does not argue that this is consciously engineered. He sees it as a psychological consequence of how good-evil language operates. Once values are framed in terms of enemies, morality cannot stop producing them. This also explains why moral disagreements under good-evil frameworks feel existential. To challenge a value is not to offer an alternative, it is to threaten the moral identity built around opposition. Disagreement becomes dangerous, not merely mistaken. Nietzsche's insight here is unsettling. Morality that depends on enemies cannot ultimately aim at reconciliation. It requires permanent moral tension. Its stability depends on ongoing opposition. This prepares the next step in the analysis. If good-evil morality requires enemies, then it must also become deeply concerned with intentions, because intentions allow enemies to be detected even when no harm has yet occurred. That shift inward is the next transformation Nietzsche wants us to examine. With the emergence of good and evil, morality undergoes a decisive inward turn. Nietzsche insists that this shift is not a refinement of moral sensitivity, but a reorientation of moral attention. What matters is no longer primarily what one does, but what one intends, and eventually what one desires. In earlier good-bad frameworks, responsibility was external and visible. Actions were judged publicly. One could fail, succeed, act foolishly, or act well. But morality did not probe beneath the surface. The inner life was largely irrelevant. Instincts were taken as facts of existence, not moral problems. Good-evil morality cannot function this way. If evil is understood as something that wills harm, then morality must learn to read minds. It must concern itself with motives, intentions, and hidden desires. The moral gaze turns inward, and with it comes a new form of power. Nietzsche sees this as the birth of moral psychology, not as inquiry, but as suspicion. The question shifts from what happened to what were you really trying to do? Even when no harm occurs, the individual can still be morally condemned for what they might have intended. This inward turn dramatically expands the reach of morality. Actions are finite, intentions are not. One can always be suspected of impure motives. Even self-understanding becomes morally fraught. Individuals begin to interrogate themselves, searching for hidden desires that might betray moral failure. Nietzsche argues that this creates a split within the self. The individual is no longer a unified actor, but a divided being, part instinct, part judge. Desire becomes something to be monitored. Spontaneity becomes dangerous. Even joy must justify itself. This internal division is not accidental. It is necessary for good-evil morality to maintain control without constant external enforcement. Once individuals learn to suspect themselves, morality no longer needs to punish openly. People police their own thoughts. The moralization of intention also changes how responsibility works. Outcomes matter less than purity of motive. One can cause harm with good intentions and be forgiven, or cause no harm with bad intentions and be condemned. Morality becomes detached from life as it actually unfolds and reattached to inner narrative. Nietzsche believes this is psychologically exhausting. When morality lives inside the mind, there is no refuge, there is no moment free from evaluation. The individual carries the courtroom everywhere. This inward moral gaze also reshapes how people relate to others. Interactions become interpretive. One looks not only at what someone does, but at what they might mean. Trust erodes. Suspicion becomes a virtue. Moral insight is equated with the ability to detect hidden corruption. Nietzsche does not deny that attention to intention can restrain certain harms. His concern is the cost. A morality obsessed with inner purity cannot tolerate ambiguity. It cannot accept instinct. It cannot allow life to simply unfold. Everything must be justified internally before it can be lived externally. This is the moment where morality begins to produce what Nietzsche later calls bad conscience. The feeling that one is morally compromised simply by having instincts at all. Desire itself becomes evidence against the self. Once morality has moved this deeply inward, it requires a stabilizing mechanism. Constant suspicion generates constant tension. That tension must be managed. It must be explained, and that explanation takes the form of guilt. Understanding how guilt enters the moral world is therefore the next step in Nietzsche's analysis. Nietzsche treats guilt not as a natural moral emotion, but as a historical and psychological invention. It is not simply the feeling of having done something wrong. It is the feeling of being wrong, of standing in permanent moral debt. This distinction is crucial. In earlier good-bad frameworks, failure carried consequences, but not moral contamination. One could fail, lose status, or suffer misfortune without internalizing blame. Responsibility was limited to actions and outcomes. Once the event passed, life moved on. There was no lingering sense that one's existence itself was compromised. Good-evil morality changes this completely. Once morality turns inward and focuses on intention, responsibility no longer ends with the act. Because motives are invisible and ongoing, judgment becomes continuous. The individual is never fully cleared. Guilt becomes durational rather than situational. Nietzsche argues that guilt enters the moral world as a way of stabilizing inner conflict. When instincts are treated as dangerous and intentions as morally suspect, the individual experiences constant tension. Guilt provides a narrative that explains this tension. It tells the individual, "You feel divided because you are guilty." Moral discomfort becomes evidence of moral failure. This is psychologically powerful. Instead of questioning the moral system that produces anxiety, the individual blames themselves. The problem is no longer morality's demands. It is one's inability to meet them. Guilt redirects conflict away from values and toward the self. Nietzsche also notes that guilt introduces the idea of moral debt. One does not merely make mistakes. One owes something. This debt is not easily repaid because it is tied to inner states rather than concrete actions. One can never be fully certain that one's motives are pure. Repayment is therefore endless. This endlessness is essential. A morality that relies on guilt must ensure that guilt never completely dissolves. Temporary guilt could be resolved through action. Permanent guilt keeps the individual morally dependent. They remain in need of forgiveness, correction, or moral approval. Guilt also explains why good-evil morality becomes deeply serious. Moral life acquires weight, gravity, and urgency. Laughter becomes suspect. Lightness feels irresponsible. Joy must justify itself. The emotional tone of life shifts toward solemnity. Nietzsche contrasts this with shame. Shame is situational. It arises in response to visible failure and fades when circumstances change. Guilt, by contrast, attaches to the self. It follows the individual across situations. It becomes part of identity. This transformation produces a new moral subject, someone who experiences themselves as morally compromised by default. Even when acting well, they feel the pressure of moral scrutiny. Even when no harm is done, they sense potential wrongdoing. Nietzsche sees this as a decisive step toward moral domination. Once guilt is internalized, external control becomes unnecessary. Individuals discipline themselves. They interpret their own suffering as deserved. They accept moral judgment, even in the absence of accusers. This is why guilt is so resilient. It does not require belief in God or explicit doctrine. It survives secularization. It persists as a background emotional state, a vague sense that one is failing to live up to something, even when that something is never clearly named. At this stage, morality has acquired enormous psychological reach. It governs action, intention, emotion, and self-understanding. But guilt alone is not enough to sustain this system. It must be given meaning. It must be justified. Otherwise, it risks collapsing into despair. The mechanism that gives guilt its meaning is the moralization of suffering. If guilt explains inner conflict, suffering explains why that guilt matters. That is the next step in Nietzsche's analysis. Once guilt becomes a permanent feature of inner life, morality faces a problem. Guilt without explanation leads to despair. If people are to live under constant moral tension, that tension must be given meaning. Nietzsche argues that this is where suffering is moralized. In a good-bad framework, suffering is largely neutral. It can be unfortunate, tragic, or inconvenient, but it does not automatically signify moral failure. Pain happens, loss happens. There is no requirement that suffering means something beyond itself. Good-evil morality cannot accept this. If guilt is real and inner conflict is constant, then suffering must be interpreted as evidence. Pain becomes a sign that something is wrong, with oneself, with one's intentions, or with one's moral standing. Suffering is no longer merely endured, it is read. Nietzsche sees this as a decisive escalation. Once suffering is moralized, it is no longer accidental, it becomes purposeful. Pain must now justify itself by pointing beyond itself. It must be explained, accounted for, and fitted into a moral narrative. This serves several psychological functions at once. First, it stabilizes guilt. If suffering is evidence of moral failure, then guilt feels warranted. The discomfort of inner conflict is no longer arbitrary. It is deserved. Second, it gives suffering dignity. Endurance becomes virtue. Pain becomes proof of moral depth. This transformation is seductive because it rescues meaning where meaning threatens to collapse. A world without explanation is intolerable under conditions of powerlessness. Moralized suffering restores order. It tells people why they hurt and what their pain signifies. But Nietzsche insists that this rescue comes at a price. Once suffering is moralized, life itself comes under suspicion. Pleasure becomes questionable. Joy appears irresponsible. Strength looks dangerous. If pain has moral meaning, then its absence must be morally justified. This is where morality begins to reward suffering rather than overcoming it. To endure becomes better than to change. To bear pain becomes nobler than to risk transformation. The individual learns to value their wounds rather than heal them. Nietzsche also notes that moralized suffering deepens resentment. If one's pain is meaningful, then someone must be responsible for it. even if that responsibility is abstract or delayed. Suffering demands explanation, and explanation tends toward blame. This dynamic reinforces the good-evil framework. Pain confirms the existence of evil. Evil explains pain. The moral world closes in on itself. Suffering becomes both proof and fuel of moral certainty. Over time, this produces a culture skilled at interpreting pain, but poor at reducing it. Energy flows into judgment rather than action. Meaning replaces transformation. Consolation replaces creation. Nietzsche does not deny that moralized suffering can sustain people through hardship. His concern is long-term. A morality that needs suffering in order to justify itself will eventually prefer suffering to risk. It will learn to preserve pain rather than eliminate it. This prepares the ground for the next development Nietzsche believes is inevitable. If suffering is morally valuable, then denial begins to look virtuous. Renunciation becomes admirable. Life itself becomes something that must be restrained rather than affirmed. That development is what Nietzsche calls the ascetic ideal, and it cannot be understood without seeing how good and evil first taught suffering to speak the language of morality. Once morality has learned to read intention, produce guilt, and moralize suffering, it cannot remain limited or contextual. Nietzsche argues that good and evil must claim universality in order to function. This is not a philosophical ambition. It is a psychological necessity. Good, evil morality cannot tolerate being one value system among others. If it did, its judgments would lose force. Evil would become relative. Guilt would weaken. Suffering would lose its moral meaning. For this system to survive, its categories must apply to everyone, everywhere. This is why good and evil present themselves as absolute. They do not ask for agreement, they demand obedience. They do not offer persuasion, they assert necessity. Moral language shifts from "this is how we live" to "this is how one must live." Nietzsche sees this universalizing impulse as a direct extension of reactive valuation. Slave morality cannot risk coexistence with alternative values because alternative values expose it as contingent rather than necessary. If someone can live differently without being evil, then evil itself becomes questionable. Universality solves this problem. Once values are universal, disagreement becomes immorality. Difference becomes deviation. To reject the moral framework is no longer a choice, it is a transgression. Moral authority no longer needs to explain itself. It enforces itself by definition. This is why Nietzsche believes universal moral claims are so emotionally charged. They are not defended rationally, they are defended existentially. If universality collapses, the entire moral economy built on guilt, suffering, and inner judgment begins to unravel. Universal morality also eliminates rank. Difference in value becomes injustice. Hierarchy becomes oppression. Excellence becomes exclusion. Any visible asymmetry must be morally explained away or condemned. The world is flattened not descriptively, but morally. Nietzsche is careful here. He is not arguing that universality is logically false. He is arguing that it is functionally motivated. Universal moral language disguises its origin by presenting itself as timeless truth rather than historical strategy. This disguise has consequences. Once morality is universal, it becomes self-protective. Questioning it is treated as moral failure. Critique becomes suspicion. Revaluation becomes threat. Morality closes ranks around itself. At this point, morality no longer serves life, it governs it. It no longer asks what kind of human beings it produces, it demands conformity. The moral order becomes autonomous, enforcing itself through guilt, accusation, and exclusion. Nietzsche believes this is why modern moral discourse often feels brittle and aggressive at the same time. It insists on certainty, but cannot tolerate scrutiny. It proclaims compassion, but reacts with hostility to challenge. These are not contradictions. They are symptoms of a morality that must remain unquestioned to survive. Once morality has universalized itself, it no longer needs explicit belief. It lives in language, habit, and emotional reflex. People inherit it without knowing where it came from. They enforce it without knowing why. This universality is what allows good and evil to persist long after their original historical conditions have faded. It becomes background reality. It becomes common sense. At this stage, morality has achieved its maximum reach, but also its maximum cost. The individual is now permanently judged, permanently indebted, permanently evaluated against an absolute standard. The psychological consequences of this condition are not accidental. They are the next thing Nietzsche wants us to confront. Nietzsche insists that the most serious consequence of good and evil is not political or theological. It is psychological. Once moral language reorganizes inner life around guilt, suspicion, and universal judgment, it produces a distinctive kind of human being, one who is divided against themselves. In a good-evil framework, the self is never simply allowed to be. Every impulse is potentially suspect. Every desire must be examined. Even harmless pleasures can feel morally risky. The individual becomes both actor and judge, instinct and interrogator. Life is no longer lived directly. It is constantly interpreted. Nietzsche sees this as the source of modern moral anxiety. People feel morally insufficient even when they have done nothing wrong. They carry a background sense of failure without a clear object. This is not accidental. It is the emotional residue of a morality that demands inner purity rather than concrete responsibility. The inward moral gaze also fragments attention. Instead of engaging the world, individuals turn inward, monitoring themselves for signs of moral deviation. Energy that might have gone into creation, experimentation, or risk is redirected into self-surveillance. Action gives way to rumination. This produces a paradox Nietzsche finds revealing. The more morality claims to protect human dignity, the more fragile people become. They fear missteps, they avoid risk, they seek moral safety rather than strength. Life narrows. Nietzsche also observes that this psychological structure fosters resentment toward vitality. Those who act decisively, confidently, or creatively can trigger moral unease simply by existing. Their ease highlights one's own inner conflict. Moral judgment becomes a way of neutralizing that discomfort. Over time, good-evil morality trains people to experience intensity as danger. Passion feels irresponsible. Ambition feels suspect. Strong emotion requires justification. The safest moral posture becomes restraint, moderation, and caution. This is not neutrality. It is a moral preference for harmlessness. Nietzsche worries that when harmlessness becomes the highest virtue, the conditions for greatness disappear. Cultures become skilled at preventing harm but incapable of producing depth. Another psychological cost is the erosion of self-trust. When instincts are treated as potential moral liabilities, individuals lose confidence in their own responses. They look outward for moral validation. Authority shifts from lived experience to moral consensus. This dependency creates anxiety rather than security. If moral standards are external and universal, one is always vulnerable to judgment. One's worth depends on alignment rather than achievement. Belonging replaces excellence. Nietzsche does not claim that this condition produces immediate collapse. He claims it produces flattening. Emotional range narrows. Aspiration lowers. Risk becomes pathological. Life is managed rather than lived. This psychological flattening prepares the way for something Nietzsche finds even more troubling. When vitality is experienced as dangerous and suffering as meaningful, denial begins to look virtuous. Renunciation appears safe. Restraint becomes admirable. At this point, morality no longer merely judges life. It begins to turn against it. That turn is what Nietzsche calls the ascetic ideal, and it is the final transformation of good and evil into a morality of life denial. At this point, Nietzsche makes a move that is easy to miss, and even easier to misread. He does not say that the transition from good-bad to good-evil was a foolish error or a moral accident. He treats it as a turning point, a response to real historical and psychological pressures. This matters because Nietzsche is not interested in blaming the past. He is interested in understanding how values evolve under constraint. Good and evil emerged because earlier ways of valuing were no longer sufficient for the conditions people found themselves in. When direct action became impossible, when power was blocked, and when suffering demanded explanation, moral language adapted. From this perspective, good-evil morality was adaptive. It allowed people to survive psychologically under conditions of long-term powerlessness. It restored meaning where meaning was threatened. It provided dignity where dignity was denied. It transformed endurance into virtue and suffering into significance. Nietzsche takes this seriously. He does not mock the people who needed this transformation. He does not dismiss their values as stupid or dishonest. He sees good-evil morality as a creative response to unbearable conditions, a way of preserving a sense of worth when life could not be affirmed directly. This is why Nietzsche refuses to treat moral history as a story of enlightenment replacing ignorance. It is a story of strategies replacing strategies. Each moral framework solves a problem, and in doing so creates new problems of its own. Good and evil solved the problem of meaning under oppression. It answered the question, why do we suffer? It gave suffering a voice. It allowed people to endure what they could not change. In that sense, it was a genuine achievement. But Nietzsche insists that what is adaptive in one context can become destructive in another. A morality built for endurance does not automatically suit conditions that require creativity, risk, and self-assertion. What once preserved life can later restrict it. This is the crucial insight. Nietzsche is not arguing that good and evil are false. He is arguing that they are historical. They arose under specific pressures. When those pressures change, the morality may no longer fit the life it governs. The danger arises when a historically necessary moral framework forgets its own origins. Once good and evil present themselves as eternal truths rather than adaptive responses, they become inflexible. They demand obedience even when they no longer serve the conditions of life. Nietzsche believes modern humanity is caught precisely in this situation. We inherit a moral language forged under conditions of powerlessness, but live in a world that increasingly demands initiative, creativity, and self-direction. The result is tension. Values pull in one direction. Life pushes in another. This mismatch produces confusion rather than clarity. People experience moral pressure without understanding its source. They feel constrained without knowing why. They obey values that no longer align with the kind of life they are trying to live. Nietzsche's concern is not that good and evil ever existed. It is that they refuse to let go. They continue to govern by habit long after their original function has faded. What was once a turning point becomes a trap. This is why Nietzsche insists that moral history must be understood before moral reform is possible. One cannot simply abolish good and evil. One must first see what they did, why they worked, and why they now impose costs they were never designed to manage. Only from that understanding can something new emerge. That brings Nietzsche to his next question. If good and evil once made life bearable under denial, what happens when denial itself becomes the highest value? That question leads directly to the ascetic ideal. Once good and evil have reshaped moral language, inner life, guilt, suffering, and universality, Nietzsche argues that morality reaches a critical threshold. At this point, morality no longer merely judges life, it begins to suspect life itself. This suspicion is what makes the ascetic ideal not an anomaly, but a logical next step. Good-evil morality teaches that instincts are dangerous, intentions are suspect, and suffering is meaningful. Taken together, these lessons quietly imply something more radical, that life, as it is naturally lived, is morally compromised. Desire becomes temptation, strength becomes risk, pleasure becomes something that must justify itself. Nietzsche insists that this shift does not require hatred of life at first. It begins as caution. Restraint is praised, moderation is admired, self-control becomes virtue. But once restraint is moralized, excess begins to look sinful and vitality begins to look irresponsible. This is the psychological doorway to asceticism. If suffering is meaningful, then avoiding pleasure appears morally superior. If guilt is permanent, then denial appears purifying. If instincts are suspect, then suppressing them appears wise. Renunciation becomes a path to moral security. Nietzsche is careful here. Asceticism is not simply self-denial for its own sake. It is denial in the service of meaning. It offers a way to manage guilt, interpret suffering, and stabilize inner conflict. In a moral world structured by good and evil, asceticism becomes not extreme, but reasonable. This is why the ascetic ideal is so powerful. It promises relief from moral anxiety. If life is the problem, then denying life becomes the solution. One no longer needs to resolve tension by acting differently in the world. One resolves it by wanting less from life itself. Asceticism also solves another problem created by good and evil: exhaustion. Constant moral vigilance is draining. Denial simplifies. Renunciation narrows desire. The fewer instincts one acknowledges, the fewer conflicts one must manage. Asceticism offers psychological economy. Nietzsche sees this as a tragic but understandable development. A moral system that cannot affirm life must eventually turn against it. The ascetic ideal is morality's attempt to preserve itself when affirmation becomes impossible. This is why Nietzsche treats asceticism not as hypocrisy, but as honesty. It admits implicitly that the moral framework cannot coexist peacefully with life's demands. Rather than reforming morality, it restrains life. At this stage, morality reaches its most extreme form. It no longer merely governs action or intention, it governs existence itself. Life must justify itself morally, and when it cannot, it must be denied. Nietzsche believes this is the final transformation of good and evil. Once asceticism becomes idealized, morality completes its reversal. Values that once emerged to make life bearable now declare life itself unworthy. Understanding this progression is essential because it explains why the ascetic ideal feels so compelling and why it is so dangerous. It is not an aberration. It is the end point of a moral language that began with condemnation and never learned how to affirm. With this, Nietzsche has traced the arc from descriptive valuation to life denial. What remains is to step back and see what this transformation means, and why it cannot simply be undone by argument. That final reflection is the task of the last segment. Nietzsche does not end this analysis with a solution. He ends it with a diagnosis. The shift from good-bad to good-evil is not a historical curiosity. It is a transformation that still structures how modern people judge themselves, others, and life itself. Even where belief has faded, the moral language remains. We still interpret intention rather than action. We still feel guilt without clear cause. We still moralize suffering and suspect vitality. We still treat disagreement as immorality rather than difference. These habits persist not because we have chosen them, but because we have inherited a moral vocabulary that trains us to see the world this way. Nietzsche's point is not that good and evil should simply be rejected. A moral language cannot be discarded by decision. It lives too deeply in instinct, emotion, and habit. What can be done, and what Nietzsche demands, is that this language be understood. Once the origins of moral concepts are visible, they lose their false innocence. They can be evaluated rather than obeyed blindly. One can begin to ask whether a moral framework still serves the kind of life one is trying to live, or whether it has begun to work against it. This is why Nietzsche treats this distinction as preparatory rather than final. Before new values can be created, inherited values must be stripped of their claim to eternity. One must see that good and evil were answers to a problem, not eternal truths, and answers that once preserved life can later constrain it. Understanding the difference between good, bad, and good, evil, is therefore not an academic exercise. It is a way of recognizing how deeply moral language shapes experience. It explains why moral life feels heavy, why joy feels risky, and why strength often feels suspicious even to those who value it. Nietzsche does not tell us what values must replace good and evil. He knows that values cannot be invented on command. What he does is clear the ground. He shows that the moral world we take for granted is the product of history, psychology, and necessity, not inevitability. This recognition opens a possibility rather than closing one. If moral language was created, it can be recreated. If values emerged under constraint, they can emerge again under different conditions. But this cannot happen until the old language loosens its grip. That is why Nietzsche's analysis still unsettles. It does not offer comfort, it offers clarity. And clarity is dangerous when it reveals that what we experience as moral obligation may once have been a strategy for survival. The distinction between good and evil and good and bad is therefore not the end of Nietzsche's critique. It is the final step before morality turns fully against life, and before the need for a radical revaluation becomes unavoidable. That revaluation begins with the ascetic ideal,